The fog lay heavy on the Seine that night, wrapping the quays in a silence so deep it seemed to muffle even the city's pulse. From the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Maigret watched the ghostly glow of the street lamps tremble in the mist. Somewhere, through the hum of distant barges, a radio crackled, a voice without a name, calm and deliberate, speaking of a murder that had not yet been discovered. Maigret listened in stillness. The tone was almost polite, almost intimate. Then the broadcast ended, leaving only static. He stood motionless, pipe between his fingers, feeling that strange chill that came not from the damp air, but from the certainty that the words had been meant for him. The radio in the duty room was tested twice, same frequency, same wavelength, yet no trace of the broadcast could be found. The operator swore the machine had been off, but Maigret knew what he had heard, and by dawn the body of a woman was found near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a portable radio beside her, still hissing with the same electric ghost. The story begins here, amid smoke, rain, and the uneasy static of a city that never quite sleeps, a case that would lead Maigret into the half-world between confession and performance, truth and signal, where voices could travel through walls but never reveal their faces. Before we descend into that fog with him, take a moment to light your own lamp. Subscribe to this channel. Share the story with a friend who loves mysteries, and step with us into the world of Maigret, where nothing is louder than silence, and even a whisper on the air can become evidence. The night seemed to have closed a lid over Paris, the kind that turns every window into a low candle, every step into a muffled thought. Maigret stood in the corridor of the Quai des Orfèvres with his coat open, pipe cooling between his fingers, listening to the building breathe. The duty room down the hall flickered with the restless glow of valves warming in a radio set no one wanted to admit still mattered. He had been on his way out, hat in hand, when the hiss rose like a tide and a voice unfolded from it, measured, mild, and too sure of itself. No one else had decided to hear it first. The constable at the desk had looked up with the innocent stare of a man caught daydreaming, then frowned as if someone had called his name from a stairwell. The voice went on, unhurried, speaking of a woman without a name, a street without an address, the kind of half-sketched map one gives a child and tells him to wander. It was the tone that held Maigret in place, not taunting, not theatrical, but confiding, as if speaking to a friend in a corner of a café where the lamp is yellow and the cheap wine gentle on the throat. He didn't move while it lasted. There was only that human current sailing across the crackle, describing a meeting near the river, a habit of walking late, the exact tilt of a hat brim that seemed to keep her face forever in the half-light. The words came with an odd courtesy. They suggested knowledge he did not yet have and would rather not possess. Janvier, summoned by a look alone, slipped into the doorway, shoulder to the jamb, listening. The voice paused once, briefly, and in that space Maigret felt the building's stillness press against him with a raw clarity. The rasp of a pen in an office, the sleepy clank of pipes, a gust from the Seine that crept under the windowsill like a cat nosing at a bowl. When the voice resumed, it ended with a phrase that belonged more to confession than to reporting. It asked the air not for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. Then a soft click, and the radio fell back into its ocean of static. He told no one to turn the set off. He waited, counting silently to himself, and heard only the familiar snow. The operator came, apologetic, fiddling with the dials while swearing under his breath that the receiver had been idle 5 minutes ago and could not have spoken. Maigret watched the man's hands, the habit of his fingers. It was not the technician's fault. The city has rooms that talk to each other without permission. He took the pipe to his mouth, did not light it, and stared at the black mouth of the corridor as if it had just whispered a name he had not caught. The night outside held its breath. Somewhere along the river a barge horn bellowed like a cow, calling its calf home. "Did you get the frequency?" he asked Janvier at last. "Between stations," Janvier said, "like a thing drifting. I tried to mark it." "Drifting," Maigret repeated, and felt the word settle inside him with the weight of a small stone. Drifting had always been Paris's way when it wanted to hide something in plain sight. He pictured the lamps under the bridges, the water folding light into strips and carrying them off like lost ribbons. The voice had not been urgent. It had known there was time, either because the act had already happened or because it was a man who liked to walk ahead of himself, laying his thoughts like breadcrumbs. He went to the window and wiped a half-moon in the condensation with the back of his hand. The opposite quay showed itself reluctantly, a handful of lamps and a hunched figure crossing the street as if it disliked being seen. He traced the brim of his hat and set it aside, deciding there would be no comfortable return to Boulevard Richelieu tonight. Madame Maigret would have left a plate under the towel, the steam now gone, the smell of leeks and ham clinging patiently to the kitchen. He felt that domestic image flicker and recede. Cases sometimes had a quiet opening, a door nudged by a draught, rather than thrown wide. This one had opened with a whisper. "Get Lucas," he said, quietly, "and the list of private transmitters we never admit exist." Janvier's mouth tightened in a way that signaled fatigue more than surprise. He went. Maigret stood in the doorway of the duty room and looked at the set, its guts glowing like coals behind a wire mesh, the polished knobs slyly reflecting his face in grains. He remembered a time when the city carried news by footsteps, by messengers barging into offices with wet coats and sheets of cheap paper dripping ink. Now, words rode the air. They slipped through brick, insinuated themselves under doors, arrived without witnesses. He did not distrust the machine so much as the pleasure men took in using it to be more than they were. A radio allowed a timid soul to borrow a voice, and borrowed voices often told truths ordinary tongues would never dare. "Sir," said the operator, damp on the forehead, "I checked the logs, nothing transmitted to us, and no one scheduled on that band, not after midnight." "It did not schedule itself," Maigret said mildly. "It came like a caller who prefers to wait outside and smoke where he can see the windows." He found the matchbox in his pocket and toyed with it, lighting the pipe only to taste the warmth and then letting it fade. Smoke curled and thinned. He thought of the woman sketched by the voice, the late walks, the brim of the hat. Not a type, not exactly. More a careful stencil cut by someone who knew the edges of a life but not the center. It had not named her. There was mercy in that, or a kind of cowardice. Men who murder often speak of their victims in ways that make them sound like fixtures in their own story. Men who broadcast understand that a voice shapes a person more than a name does, at least for a time. Lucas arrived with his collar up and the weary readiness of a man woken from a nap, taken in a chair. He listened with his head bowed slightly, as though the description itself had a frequency he might catch. The list of known amateurs, men with makeshift aerials on roofs, shopkeepers who tinkered with coils in back rooms, retired telegraphists who felt homesick for the tap of code, looked both too long and too short. Too long because Paris is full of people who love to make devices speak, too short because those who mattered would never declare themselves. Lucas took the paper without ceremony. "We begin with those nearest the river," he suggested. "Sound travels differently there." "We begin with those whose windows never sleep," Maigret said. Men who keep lamps lit after 2, who drink alone, who answer doors in shirt sleeves no matter the month. Add the press offices where night editors grow superstitious toward dawn. They divided the city without speaking of it, as they often had. Janvier would sweep the eastern blocks where low buildings huddled around courtyards like families whispering secrets. Lucas would haunt the clattering avenues near the stations, where a provincial train arriving at an ungodly hour gave honest men excuses to be awake. Maigret kept for himself the old lanes along the Seine, where cafes washed their steps in pails of grey water, and the cold ran its fingers under one's coat. He put on his hat and felt the weight of the brim steady him. He set off without hurry. The walk would let the thoughts settle and rise in their own order. The river met him with a damp paw to the face. The lamps along the quay sighed in their glass. In a baker's doorway, a boy in an apron smoked something that would do him no good and stared at the water as if it might begin talking. Maigret passed without comment. Across the street a radio stirred from behind curtains, a thin melody he could not place. It felt indecent, the way music sometimes does when men are dead and not yet discovered. He pushed the thought away but could not stop it from leaving a fingerprint. He turned into a lane where the buildings leaned in, as if listening. The small radios of the city, whispers, shutters, the scratch of a chair on a bare floor, seemed to tune themselves to him. He had been a policeman long enough to know that cases often begin, not with a clue, but with a temperature, a humidity of the soul that tells you whether a man is lying to himself. The voice had smelled of a certain kind of truth, the truth of those who decorate their lies with details in order to marvel at their own accuracy. He stopped before a shop window where a collection of second-hand sets stood in a row, their dials like drowsy eyes. A card in the glass promised repairs while you wait. Inside, a kerosene lamp burned on a counter beside a neat mound of resistors in paper envelopes. The lamp's glass chimney needed a wipe. He stepped in. The shopkeeper, a narrow fellow with a careful moustache and the posture of a man who apologized to his socks when he put them on, looked up as if surprised to see the door open at such an hour. "We're closed," he began, then recognized Maigret not by name but by type. The coat, the stance, the way the hat never quite left the head in public places. "For a moment," Maigret said, "I want to look." The man's eyes cooled. He would have liked to say no, but he had already stepped back. The cases smelled of glue and dust. In a corner, an aerial wire climbed the wall like a vine. "You work late," Maigret said. "Does the city speak to you after midnight?" "I fix," the man answered. Those who listen are never satisfied with what they hear. They imagine better music somewhere else. "Do you prefer music or voices?" "I prefer the silence after I switch them off." Maigret admired the answer, which could mean honesty or fear. He gestured to a small set whose face bore a cigarette burn on the bakelight. "This one heard something it didn't want to." "They all do," the shopkeeper murmured. "Have you ever fixed a transmitter instead of a receiver?" Maigret asked. He kept his tone curious, nothing more. The man's mouth twitched. "There are not many in Paris, and they are illegal." "Some illegality is a matter of timing," Maigret said. "We breathe at the wrong hour and call it a crime." He bent to the lamp and watched the flame jerk in a draught. The room had another door, a narrow one veiled by a beaded curtain. He could feel the life behind it, a cot, a plate with breadcrumbs, a pair of boots whose heels needed repair. "If a man wanted to be heard by exactly the people he chose," he continued, "and no one else, could he do it?" "With a transmitter, a plan, and patience," the shopkeeper said. "But he would be a fool. Words persuade, yes, but they also orbit. They come back. There was a voice, Maigret said. A polite one. It described a scene near the river. It spoke as if it had time. The shopkeeper looked down, then up again, a tick of conscience. Many men speak late at night. Paris is full of them. And some women, Maigret said softly. The man's eyes flickered. I fix radios. I don't fix people. Neither do I, Maigret said, straightening. I only listen to how they crackle. He left a card on the counter that the man would pretend not to see until he was alone. On the pavement again, he felt the damp fold itself into his cuffs. He stood under the awning and watched the street think. A cat crossed with surgical care. From a window above, a cough. He imagined the voice setting its equipment in order, checking the connections with the tenderness of a violinist, touching strings before an orchestra wakes. It would not call again tonight, he suspected. Men who dared once often savoured their own daring like a sweet in the mouth. He reached the corner where the wind sharpened and paused, feeling suddenly that the city had shifted a little to one side, as a sleeper does when a dream grows heavy. Somewhere a figure changed direction, somewhere the river gathered something into its clothes. He turned back toward the quay, not to rest, but to gather his men into the shape the case required. A telegram might already be on its way, he thought, from a station house by the river, or a hotel where a clerk had seen a guest leave and not return for a toothbrush. He disliked the anticipation that came just before dawn, the pale hour when Paris pretended to be innocent. At the Quai des Orfèvres again, the corridor breathed the same tired air, but the duty room felt altered, as rooms do once a secret has sat briefly in a chair. He told Lucas to draw a line of visits beginning at the telegraph offices where night men read the papers upside down, ending at cafes where old radios hung under the clock like dusty saints. He marked the map with a pencil that had been chewed by someone who feared losing it. When he put the pipe back in his mouth at last and struck a match, the flames spread a small warmth, not only to his face, but to the resolve hardening in his chest. The voice had asked to be heard. It would be answered, though not in the language it preferred. As the match died, the telephone rang, a thin insect sound against the window's hush. Janvier lifted it and listened without speaking, colour leaving his face in a slow, disciplined retreat. He covered the mouthpiece and looked at Maigret. "A woman," he said quietly. "Near Boulevard Saint-Germain, found by a milkman. There's a radio beside her, still hissing." Maigret nodded once. No surprise, no performance. He took his hat, set it on his head with the slight forward tilt that kept rain off his brows, and felt the weight of the case become real under his skin, not a rumour in the air, but a body in the world. The city had made its move, polite as ever. He stepped into the corridor, the pipe unlit now, and the building's sounds aligned themselves to his stride. The dawn was waiting like a witness who had rehearsed his statement and still feared to speak. The dawn did not so much arrive as seep in slow and reluctant, as though Paris had no wish to be seen in this condition. The mist along the river had thickened overnight, curling in slow motion around the bridges, settling on the cobbles like old linen hung out to dry. Maigret's breath came in visible plumes as he stepped down from the black Citroën and closed the door with a hollow click. The world felt made of wet stone and silence. Only the faint thrum of an approaching milk cart broke the stillness, its wooden wheels beating an uneven rhythm on the quay. The Seine lapped the edge of the embankment, dark and patient, reflecting little but the uncertain grey of the sky. A sergeant de ville raised a gloved hand in greeting or apology. The body lay near the low wall, half in shadow, half in the pallid spill of light from a single gas lamp that had burned through the night. A woman, well dressed, her hat fallen sideways into the puddle beside her, her face turned toward the water as if listening. The portable radio by her hand hissed softly, an indecisive sound that might have been wind if one chose not to believe in ghosts. Maigret knelt, his knees stiff from the damp. The scent that rose to him was a mixture of perfume and iron, of the city's heart and its habit of indifference. Her gloves were still on, no sign of struggle, no mud on the soles. She had not fought whoever brought her here. He pressed a finger to the radio's dial. The machine trembled faintly under his touch, its battery still alive, as though it, too, had witnessed something it could not speak of. Janvier crouched beside him, his breath visible in the air. The milkman found her an hour ago. No papers, no handbag. Someone knew what they were doing. Maigret nodded, his gaze fixed on the soft static whispering from the radio. It wasn't merely sound, it had rhythm, a cadence one could almost mistake for breathing. He turned the dial slightly. For a moment, through the snow of noise, came a fragment, 3 words or perhaps just syllables, and then nothing. He switched it off, and the sudden silence felt heavier than before. Who called it in? The milkman. Lives 2 streets over. He's shaken. Keep him shaken, Maigret murmured. It makes them honest. He stood, the fog catching on the brim of his hat. The woman's clothes were not expensive, but chosen with care, a skirt of fine wool, shoes polished even beneath the grime, a brooch shaped like a swallow pinned neatly to her collar. It was the kind of detail that told him she had dressed to be seen, but not admired. He looked again at her face, mid-30s perhaps, Parisian certainly. The features still soft with the last residue of sleep. Across the river, the windows of the prefecture caught the faint glow of sunrise, though here the light seemed afraid to arrive. The city stirred, first the sound of a shutter, then a distant tram, then footsteps echoing in pairs. Maigret turned to Lucas, who stood by the car with a cigarette unlit between his lips. "Have the photographer come quickly," he said. "The fog will steal her before we're done." Lucas nodded and moved off, coat collar high, his outline dissolving into the pale air. Maigret remained where he was, alone beside the body, listening to the river. He thought again of the voice from the night before, the unhurried calm, the precise diction, the faint amusement threaded through it. The words had described a meeting by the water, the glint of lamplight on wet stones. He looked now at those very stones beneath his boots. They matched too well. The voice had not been warning. It had been remembrance. Whoever had spoken already knew how the scene would look in morning light. He felt the old irritation stir, not of fear, but of being manipulated. It was the same feeling one had when arriving at a cafe where someone had left before finishing their drink, the warmth of the glass still there, the cigarette still burning in the tray. You were late to a conversation that had ended without you. A small crowd began to gather despite the fog. Porters, a boy with bread under his arm, a man in an apron leaning too far forward. The sergeant kept them back, though curiosity in Paris is a fluid thing. It seeps through the smallest cracks. Maigret glanced at them briefly, taking in the faces. The one who looks longest is often the one who knows something. He walked a little further along the quay, hands in pockets, pipe between teeth. The air tasted of iron and morning. The milkman waited near his cart, hat in his hands, eyes darting between the policeman and the body. "You delivered here every day?" Maigret asked quietly. "Every other," the man said. "She wasn't here when I passed last night. I swear it." "You live nearby?" "Rue Jacob, number 7. My wife. She'll tell you." Maigret nodded. "And you didn't touch anything?" Only the radio, sir. It was making a noise. I thought maybe someone was calling for help. Then I saw—" He swallowed. "I saw her face." Maigret placed a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. "You did right to call. Go home. My men will find you later." The milkman hesitated as though unsure whether to feel thanked or dismissed. Then he tipped his cap and led his horse away, the wheels creaking faintly until they disappeared into the fog. By the time the photographer arrived, the crowd had thickened into a kind of audience. Maigret stood aside as the flash went off, cutting the mist in sudden bursts of artificial daylight. Each explosion of light seemed to make the woman more unreal, as if the act of being recorded erased her little by little. He watched until the last plate was taken, then told the men to cover her and lift her gently. The morgue wagon came, its lantern swaying like a drunkard's step. When it left, the quay seemed emptier than before, though the fog had not moved. Maigret remained, unwilling to go just yet. His gaze wandered back to the spot where she had lain. The imprint of her body on the damp stones was still visible, faint but clear, as though the city itself refused to let go of what it had just witnessed. He turned once more to the radio, now sealed in an evidence bag on the back seat of the car. A simple model, nothing special, paint chipped, one knob missing. Yet it had been present at the scene twice. First in the voice that described the crime, then beside the victim who embodied it. Coincidence had long ago ceased to be an explanation Maigret accepted. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the office smelled of damp wool and burnt coffee. The men spoke in low voices, as they always did when a case arrived with its own riddle. Maigret hung his coat and looked at the map on the wall, the black line of the Seine winding like a scar through the heart of the city. He placed a pin at the spot of discovery. Beside it, he wrote in his small, deliberate hand, "Unidentified woman, radio present." Janvier entered with a slip of paper. "Lucas traced the serial number on the radio, sold 6 months ago by a shop on Rue de Charonne, same one you visited last night." Maigret exhaled slowly, the pipe smoke curling like thought. "Then we go back," he said. "Only this time we don't ask about the machines, we ask who bought them." He looked once toward the window. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the dull silver of the river. The city was waking, pretending once again to be innocent. Yet somewhere, perhaps in a garret above a cafe or in the corner of a press room, a man was smiling at the sound of his own voice replayed in his mind. Maigret tamped the tobacco in his pipe and lit it carefully. The flame trembled, caught, and steadied. "Find me the name of the woman," he said softly, "and then find me the man who wanted her death to be heard before it happened." The clock ticked, the fog thinned, and Paris, without quite knowing it, had become a crime scene that spoke through static and silence alike. The shop on Rue de Charonne had changed its smell since the night before, or perhaps morning simply stripped a room of its flattering shadows. The kerosene lamp was gone. In its place, the thin, respectable daylight found every mote of dust, every grease smudge on the counter's edge. Maigret stood just inside the door with his hat tilted back and his coat unbuttoned, as if he had come to have a fuse replaced rather than to ask about a dead woman and a voice that spoke ahead of the clock. The shopkeeper appeared from behind the beaded curtain with the same careful moustache and the same posture of apology, but his eyes were brighter, as if he had slept badly and told himself good reasons for it. "You open early," Maigret said. "For men who work nights," the shopkeeper answered. "They break things after midnight and repent them at 8. Maigret let the corner of his mouth soften. The politeness drew a small circle around them into which the city could not intrude. He took from his pocket a folded slip, the serial number written in his compact hand. He laid it on the glass with the mildness of a man discussing a weather vane. "Sold 6 months ago," he said. "This set. I need the buyer." The shopkeeper looked at the numbers without touching the paper, then reached under the counter for a ledger whose cover had taken on the shine of a prayer book. He turned pages with a finger that left no prints, humming under his breath the way sober men do when performing a task for which they wish to be thanked later. "Here," he said, and moved the book toward Maigret. "Model, price, date, paid in cash." The name was there, written in a neat, printed hand, Monsieur Verdon. No address, only a note. Collects end of week. Repairs own aerial. The annotation irritated Maigret more than the absence of an address. It was the cosy familiarity of it, the clerk's little nod to a customer whose habits amused him. He looked up. "You remember his face?" he said, not asking. The shopkeeper's eyes slid to the window and back again. Medium height. Quiet. One of those men who listen more than they speak. But when he spoke, he shrugged. His voice was as if he had tuned it. Clear, pleasant. Age? 40, perhaps less. It is hard to tell with men who sleep odd hours. Hands? Maigret asked. The kind that belong to a transmitter? The man showed a brief, involuntary smile. Clean nails. Burns on the pads of the fingers. He knew. Solder. And where did he carry the set? In a cloth bag he had brought himself. He refused delivery, said he liked to make sure the corners didn't bruise. The shopkeeper hesitated. There was something else. He bought a spare valve he did not need for the model he chose. I told him so. He said, I make do. Men who make do, Maigret said softly, often make too much. He closed the ledger and tapped its cover once with his index finger, a benediction or a claim. He gave you no address. But you have a memory for footsteps. Where did he come from when he crossed your threshold? The turn of his head when he left? The shopkeeper considered. From the east, not the boulevard. He avoided crowds. One of the little streets. He watched the pavement when he walked, like a man counting his own cadence. Janvier, who had been pretending to examine a display of headphones with an air of scholarly interest, stepped closer without breaking the surface of the room's politeness. There's a concierge across the street, he said. She watches everything. She waters geraniums even in winter. The concierge knew Verdon without knowing his name. She knew him as the lodger on the 3rd floor of the building across from her own, the one with the attic window that pulsed a faint orange after midnight. He carries parcels, she said, with the disdain of a woman who had been promised romance by the city and given cardboard instead. Not heavy, but square. He walks like a man who does not trust his feet to remember where they've been. Visitors? Janvier asked. One woman, the concierge said, and then, to forestall the leap of imagination she saw in a policeman's eyes, added, Not like that. She came in daylight and left with nothing. Once she returned a week later and stood on the landing and did not knock. Then she went away. Maigret felt the air in the stairwell change temperature by a degree or two. Describe her. Hat with a small brim, the concierge said promptly. The kind that makes a face look serious. A brooch at the throat, silver, a bird. I remember the bird because it looked like it might fly off if she exhaled too quickly. He let the silence accept the detail, measuring its weight against the brooch he had seen that morning pinned to dead wool. He did not correct the concierge's notion of silver. The swallow had been tin, plated to a shine that fooled only in poor light. They climbed. The building smelled of onions and soap and the lingering breath of a winter that had not yet taken the hint. The landing to the 3rd floor was lined with boots, each pair turned at the angle of its owner's temperament. Outside Verdon's door, a square of carpet pressed thin where a chair sometimes sat. The mark was recent, a paler rectangle within a grey. Maigret looked up at the transom window and saw dust unsettled into a new pattern, as if a hand had passed there in the night. The door opened on a room that had been emptied with care rather than haste. The bed remained, the blanket folded with military neatness. A chair faced a mirror on the mantel, angled as though it preferred to look at the chair rather than into it. On the table, a circle of cleaner wood marked where a set had stood. The dust around it kept the memory of the machine's footprint. There were no papers, no photographs pinned to the wall, only the ghost of a life drawn with a ruler. "Men who leave nothing," Janvier said, "always leave too much of nothing." Maigret crossed to the window. From here the street looked narrower than it had from below, as if space changed its mind depending on the viewer. On the inside of the sill a small burn marked where a coil had sat. The varnish had bubbled and hardened. An aerial wire had once run up the frame. It had been removed, but a nail remained, bent back as if in courtesy. He pressed his palm to the wood and felt, absurdly, for heat. In the grate, under a careful layer of ash, lay the remains of paper that did not wish to be recognized. He knelt and lifted with 2 fingers a corner that had escaped, crisped but legible in its stubbornness. Figures, not words, columns of numbers, spacing like breath. Frequencies, intervals, a schedule written as rhythm rather than time. He held it where the light could make a friend of it. "He kept a music," he said, "not of songs, of nights." Janvier found a small box behind the mantel, wedged by someone who had learned from a mother how to hide sweets. Inside were 3 valves, 2 matching and 1 not, the extra, the shopkeeper had questioned, and a roll of wire wound with the neatness of a patient man. No letters, no bills. Verdon had preferred to pay in cash and live in air. "Neighbours?" Maigret asked. A woman with red hands and a sharp mouth said Verdon had been polite without being friendly. He returned greetings with a nod that felt like punctuation rather than speech. He kept regular, irregular hours. "He is one of those men," she said, "who makes you want to walk softer on your own floors." "And the woman?" Maigret asked. "She came twice," the woman said. She stood in the corridor and listened to the door, as if voices can be heard through wood after they have finished speaking. "The second time," she cried without making a sound. "Do you know the kind of crying that leaves the eyes dry?" That kind. He thanked her because something in the description deserved respect, and went back inside. The room looked at him as if challenging an interpretation. He sat in the chair that faced the mirror and saw not himself but the shape of a man who had sat often, listening to the room breathe, conducting the silence. He imagined the set on the table and the radio's low hum before words are chosen. He imagined Verdon speaking to the air in that polite, tuned voice, sliding his syllables into the crackle with a care that felt like tenderness. He imagined the woman in the hat with the swallow brooch listening somewhere else in the city, not understanding that she had been made into an audience before she became a subject. On the mantel, a single match had rolled into a fissure in the stone and lodged there. He fished it out. The head bore a smear of dark that was not phosphorus. He put it to his nose. Perfume, faint and fleeting, the kind that seems respectable until the wearer steps too close. Not the woman by the river. This was lighter, almost girlish. Another presence? Or the same on a different day? The city loves to swap its scents, to confuse memory with a hint of violets where there should have been tobacco. He stood and, without ceremony, pulled the mirror from its hooks. Behind it, the wall showed a rectangle of unaged plaster, and in the centre, a small pencil mark, a cross, and the number 17, divided by a line as if a child had begun a sum and forgotten to finish. He replaced the glass because some secrets are more useful when left to think they are safe. "Watch the stationers within 6 streets," he told Janvier. "Look for a man buying carbon paper and envelopes without stamps. Ask for spare coils sold to men who know what to ask for without looking." "Verdun," Janvier said. Maigret considered the name as if it had been offered to him as a brand of liquor. "A name chosen for signing ledgers," he said. "If it is his, it is not his alone." They left the room as they had found it, minus the ash that now travelled in Maigret's pocket in a folded envelope. On the landing, the concierge waited with the air of someone who wished to be thanked for having lived opposite a mystery. "Will he come back?" she asked. "If he believes we have guessed the wrong thing," Maigret said. "Men return to admire their misdirection." "And if you have guessed the right thing?" "Then he will go somewhere he expects to be missed and arrange not to be missed." On the street the day had grown less shy. A boy pushed a cart of rolls that smelled warm enough to forgive the hour. A tram clanged, impatient, as a woman kept standing. Maigret paused before the shop again and looked in. The radio faces drowsed in their row. One of them, he thought absurdly, might recognize his own. He took the pipe from his pocket and did not light it. The case had begun to show its skeleton, a man with a tuned voice and a room that had been instructed to forget him, a woman whose brooch could not keep its glitter once the fog withdrew, a city that supplied corridors and stairwells like accomplices. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he spread the salvaged scrap on his desk and studied the intervals. There was a pattern a drummer would understand, a timing that would place a voice where the listeners were by habit, insomniacs at the edge of sleep, night clerks folding papers, policemen walking back to their desks for no reason they could name. He marked a line across the map where roofs caught the signal cleanest, an oblique stroke passing from the shop in Rue de Charonne toward a darker quarter by the freight yards. "An amateur telegraph substation stands there," Lucas said, arriving with a file he had not been asked for, and that therefore was exactly the one needed. "Out of service since the war, the kind of place boys break into to prove they are larger than their jackets." "Or men," Maigret said, "to prove they are lighter than their footprints." He tapped the pencil on the map at a point that felt like a thought he had been trying to catch since the voice first settled in his ear. The city waited, watching him with its innumerable eyes. He closed his own for a moment and let the sound of the static return, not from the machine now in an evidence bag, but from memory. The human hiss, filled in by a mind that had listened too long. "We go tonight," he said. "Some confidences require darkness to be shared." He rose, and the office rose with him, papers and men aligning to an intention that had finally named itself. The river would still be speaking when they arrived. The air would carry other voices, stray, timid, uninvited. He would listen to them all because the right one, when it came, would not need to raise itself above a whisper. By late afternoon, the fog had drifted north, leaving behind a film of damp on the city that the wind worried at like a tongue on a wound. The precinct's corridors had turned sluggish with the smell of boiled coffee and wet overcoats. Maigret stood at the window of his office watching a tram crawl across the Pont Saint-Michel, its bell striking half-heartedly at pigeons that refused to move. The paper in his hand, the fragment of frequencies, had begun to make sense, only as an obsession makes sense, something that hummed just at the edge of comprehension. He felt the quiet irritation that came whenever Paris pretended to have no memory. A clerk knocked, hesitated, and entered with a visiting card. "From La Dépêche de Paris," he said. "He insists you'll want to hear him." The name on the card meant nothing to Maigret, but the corner was smudged with ink, a man who wrote fast and often. "Send him in," he said. The reporter came in with the quick eyes of one used to measuring the temperature of rooms before deciding which smile to wear. He had the pale complexion of men who keep company with printing presses and alcohol. His coat was too thin, his shoes too polished. "Inspector Maigret," he said, shaking hands as though sealing a wager. "My editor will think I'm wasting your time, but there's a matter of coincidence I can't ignore." "Coincidences," Maigret said. "Keep policemen alive and journalists employed." The man smiled without showing teeth. "Then let's call this one mutual profit." He laid a notebook on the desk, the pages crowded with shorthand. 3 weeks ago I began receiving telephone calls. No voice, only a hum, like a line tapping its own pulse. Then last Thursday, a man met me in a café near République. He spoke for 5 minutes. Calm voice, measured, said he had a story that would make the city listen. He described, almost word for word, the scene you found this morning. Maigret did not sit. "He gave you a name?" "No. He spoke as if he were dictating to the air. When I asked for details, he smiled and said, 'Details spoil belief.' Then he left. I waited for him to return the next night. Instead, I heard the same voice on my radio at home. Same words, same calm. My wife heard nothing. She was certain the set was off." "And you told no one?" The reporter's shoulders rose, fell. "I'm a journalist, you know what we are. We keep the unbelievable until it can be printed without ridicule. And I thought, perhaps it's a prank, perhaps a trick of static. But when I saw the morning paper—" "You recognized the scene?" "Yes." He hesitated. There was one thing more. The man in the café mentioned the name Verdon, said it like a punctuation mark. "Do you know it?" Maigret let the silence lengthen. "It's a name that has begun to walk in the fog," he said finally. "Why come now?" "Because I received another call today," the reporter said. "Not the same voice, a woman this time. She said, 'You listened, and now you're part of it.'" Then the line went dead. Outside, the tram's bell struck again, sharper this time. Maigret studied the man's face, looking for the vanity that makes men invent their own danger. But beneath the fatigue and the restless mouth, he saw only bewilderment. The sort of fear born from realizing one has already crossed a line without knowing when. "Where were you when you received the first calls?" he asked. "At the office, near the presses." The sound came through the telephone and through the set on my desk simultaneously. I unplugged both. The hum continued for a few seconds after. My editor said it was my nerves. Maigret sat then, heavy with thought. The notion of a transmitter was no longer enough. This was something that had learned to travel by contagion, through rumor, through sound. A voice that infected equipment as easily as it infected imagination. He wondered whether the city itself was beginning to repeat what it heard. "Describe the man," he said. "Ordinary," the reporter said. Grey coat, hat pulled low. But there was something rehearsed in his stillness, as if he'd practiced not moving. And his eyes, he looked at me the way a doctor looks at a thermometer, waiting for a number to appear. Maigret wrote the description in slow strokes. "If he contacts you again," he said, "you'll tell me at once. No more waiting for print, and no stories, not a word to your editor." The man gave a crooked smile. "You think I enjoy being the fool who believed in a ghost? I'd rather it never happened." "Ghosts are simple," Maigret said. They don't need telephones. He handed back the notebook. You'll hear from me. When the door closed, Maigret lit his pipe and let the first drag settle him. The smoke thickened the office until it felt like an extension of the river's mist. He looked again at the map, the lines of signal, of rumour, of people, all crossing as if the city had its own nervous system and someone had learned to play it like an instrument. By nightfall, he was walking alone toward the press quarter. The streets smelled of ink and damp paper. Newsboys shouted the evening headlines without conviction, their voices bouncing off the closed shutters. He stopped outside La Dépêche de Paris. The windows trembled with the vibration of the presses below. Through the glass he saw the reporter again, pacing near his desk, the telephone receiver off the hook. The man's mouth moved, but no sound reached the street. Only the faintest hum came through the window panes, a note so low it felt more in the bones than the ears. He went in. The noise swallowed him whole, the rattle of typewriters, the mechanical breathing of the press. The reporter turned, startled. "I thought you'd left," he said. "I did." Maigret looked at the receiver. "Who were you talking to?" The man's lips trembled. "No one. It rang. I answered. It was static again, but this time it shaped itself into words. It said, 'He's listening now.'" Maigret took the receiver. Only silence. Then faintly, like a sigh, turned into sound. "Bonsoir, Monsieur le Commissaire." The voice was soft, precise, and carried no accent one could place. Maigret held the line as though holding the throat of something invisible. "Who is this?" he said. A pause, then the voice again, polite as ever. "You've arrived sooner than expected. But it's better this way. Every story needs its witness." The line clicked and went dead. Maigret replaced the receiver and looked at the reporter, whose face had turned the colour of ashes. "It seems," he said, "the story has decided to print itself." He walked out into the night, where the wind had changed direction and the air smelled of rain and newsprint. The lamps along the boulevard flickered, as if testing their own voltage. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played a waltz that faded into static, and for a moment Maigret could not tell whether it came from a window or from the inside of his head. The rain began in thin needles, tapping on his hat brim, running down the collar of his coat. He walked slower, thinking of Verdun's empty room, the woman by the river, the polite voice that could find him through any wire it pleased. The city, he thought, was listening back. At the corner, a kiosk still sold the last editions. The vendor nodded to him, half asleep, and Maigret bought a copy without reading the headline. The paper crackled in his hand. He imagined the voice speaking through the presses, through the ink, through the mouths of boys shouting in the street. A crime retold until it no longer needed solving, because everyone, in repeating it, became guilty of keeping it alive. He turned toward the quay, the pipe dead in his pocket, and let the rain wash the print from his fingers. Paris shone faintly under the gaslight, and somewhere in its echoing veins the phantom voice was smiling, waiting for him to tune in again. The bell over the café door made a sound that did not belong to morning or evening, a tired ting, as if it had been rung by too many hands that didn't intend to come back. The room was narrow, its walls browned by decades of steam and talk, the ceiling low, enough to make laughter careful. A coal stove ticked in the corner, fighting a losing war with the damp. Maigret paused on the threshold to let the café appraise him, the hat, the coat, the man who came in with the weather. Madame Delaunay looked up from polishing the same glass for the third time, her expression arranged in that Parisian compromise between hospitality and self-defense. "You're open," he said. "I refuse to close," she answered, and set the glass down with a gentleness that felt like loyalty. Coffee? He nodded and slid into the end table beneath the clock. The clock, in return, pretended to keep time. A mirror ran along the wall behind the counter, its silver backing foxed into islands. It reflected the small universe of the cafe as if through a history book. The zinc counter, a pair of old men arranging cards without playing them, a girl in a navy coat with red cuffs who sipped a thin soup as if it were an obligation. From the hook above the stove hung a battered radio with a cracked fabric grill, its cord looped twice as though suffocation were a precaution. Madame Delaunay brought the cup and kept the saucer in her hand a second longer than necessary, as if reading the temperature of the man by the temperature of the coffee. "You'll tell me which sort of policeman you are," she said, not unkindly. "The kind who drinks and leaves, or the one who looks at the stains and asks where they came from?" "The second," Maigret said, and felt the café listen. She nodded, not surprised, and leaned a hip against the counter. She was a tall woman gone stout, the sort whose back had learned the shape of crates and barrels, whose wrists remembered carrying soup and grief in equal measures. Her hair, once black, had surrendered to iron. "You want to talk about the lady with the hat," she said. "What did you notice first?" Maigret asked. "Her hat, or that she was listening when no one had spoken?" "Listening," Madame said. "The hat followed. Some people put their ears through the door first. She was one of those. Came 2-3 times a week. Sat where you are. Kept her hands near the radio like it was a brazier, even when it was off." "Did she ask for it to be turned on?" "Not at first. She watched it the way you watch a sleeping dog you expect might be dreaming of your hand. Then one day, while the pot was threatening to boil over and the cards were arguing with themselves, she said, very softly, 'Could we listen?' As if the set might refuse." "What did she listen to?" "Nothing," Madame Delaunay said, and allowed herself a small, almost affectionate snort. "Nothing dressed up as something. It was between stations, a lace of white noise. You'd have called it a mistake, but she sat straighter and leaned nearer. When I turned the knob and the music finally came, she looked disappointed, like a woman who'd expected a lover and got a postman. A tram clanged on the street outside, and the café gathered itself closer, as if to keep the warmth from escaping through the door seams. The girl with the red cuffs put down her spoon and looked at the radio with the suspicious hope of someone who wants to be part of other people's conversations. The card players lifted their eyes just far enough to register that a policeman was in the room, a flake of attention drifting down onto their green baize like early snow. "She spoke to anyone?" Maigret asked. "Spoke? No, that's not what she came for. She was polite, she paid, she said thank you with a real mouth, not the kind that throws the word like a coin. The last time she came—" Madame stopped, and the café heard her stop. An empty glass chimed a little against its neighbour. "The last time there was a man. He came in close behind her, but sat at the other end, as if the door had introduced them by accident and he didn't want to be rude. He wore a grey coat. You wouldn't have noticed him unless you were a woman who has carried crates and learned to weigh men at a glance." "His face?" Maigret said. "The kind that makes a hat seem unnecessary. Eyes that saw how things worked and decided not to interfere." "He drank nothing." "I brought him water." "He said thank you as if practicing sincerity." He watched the radio, not the woman. When she left, he left. They didn't touch. The door closed behind them as if it were one door. Maigret warmed his hands around the cup without drinking. The coffee's surface made a small, dark sky. "Did the radio speak?" he asked. "It breathed," Madame said, "like a cat dreaming." He let silence finish the thought. The stove ticked again, a more urgent language now. Near the mirror, a fly that had survived the season tested the world, bumped, tested again, then relented. The zinc counter held fingerprints as if it had loved those men and women who had placed them there. Above the stove, the old radio kept its counsel. "How long have you had that set?" he asked. "Since the occupation ended. A cousin sold it cheap, said I could hang it like a saint and pray for customers. Some days," she added, "the prayers worked." He nodded toward the crack in the grill. "Has anyone touched it lately, looked behind it, asked to change the cord, fiddled with the aerial?" "Verdon," she said at once, and then caught herself. It was a name that had begun to collect echoes. "Months ago, he offered to fix the buzz for nothing, said a cafe is a church with a smaller choir, and the radio is the organ. I let him. He climbed on a chair, took off the back, breathed like a man going to sleep. Then he said the buzz was in the neighborhood, not the machine." "Did he return?" "Twice after, once to listen to a game when the set at his lodging failed, once to sit with his back to the radio, as if that would make it behave." She considered the memory from another angle. He and the lady were never here, together. "Not that I saw. If they shared time, it was when I was in the cellar arguing with the wine." Maigret sipped the coffee at last. It was strong enough to pass for advice. "Did she speak of radios elsewhere?" he asked. "Shops, collectors, friends with sets." "Only once." "She said, when I was a girl, my father told me voices travel better at night because the air is softer." She smiled without showing teeth. I asked if her father had been an engineer. "No," she said. "He was a liar who loved me." The line went through Maigret like a weather change. It rearranged his understanding of the woman on the quay, of the swallow pinned at her throat, of the careful shoes. A person who had been trained to mistrust and to forgive at the same time would listen the way she had listened, leaning toward static, as if toward confession. "Madame," he said, "did anyone ever wait for her here? A man who didn't look like he was waiting." "Men wait for women in cafes the way cats wait for fish markets," she said dryly. "But yes. The second chair at your table was often occupied by a gentleman who pretended to leave before she arrived, and then returned, as if by accident, 20 minutes later. He pretended badly. He had press ink on his fingers." "The reporter," Maigret said, and the cafe accepted the word, with a small shift of weight, a stool leg scuff, a cough. It had its opinion of men who carried notebooks like pocket mirrors. "What did he say to her?" Madame Delaunay shook her head. "They didn't speak. That was the point. They sat in the same air and listened to the same nothing. It felt like, how do you call it, a pair of believers in a church where the priest has lost his voice." The door opened on a gust that smelled of damp, stone, and bread. A delivery boy brought a crate of bottles, clinking their delicate arguments. Madame signed without looking. When the boy left, she leaned closer to Maigret and lowered her voice for no one's benefit but habit. "There is something else. After the lady stopped coming, 2 days before she was found, I received a letter, no stamp. Pushed under the door between the first and second sleeps, it said, 'If someone asks, tell him the voices are not on the air, they are in the air.' No name, no address." "Do you still have it?" She opened the drawer under the till and produced a white envelope that had learned to be grey by association. Inside lay a single sheet, typed on a machine, with a weak R and a jealous E. The sentence stood alone in the middle, like a man on a bridge at night. Maigret read it twice, then turned the paper over. Nothing. He lifted it to his nose, carbon and dust, a touch, just a touch, of cheap cologne, the kind one applies to feel that decisions are being made with authority. "The reporter received a call today," Maigret said, "from a woman." "You listened?" and now you're part of it. Did your lady have a voice that could make a telephone both a promise and a threat? She had the sort of voice that makes a waiter bring bread without asking, Madame said. But she didn't use it, not with people, with radios perhaps. He finished his cup, left coins that made the saucer tilt with gratitude, and stood. The cafe inhaled, then exhaled, finding its balance. If the man in the grey coat returns, he said, tell him the coffee has improved. Men who like to watch rarely resist the chance to be seen. Madame half smiled. And if the lady returns? She will not, Maigret said softly. But her absence will keep coming in to look around. He glanced once more at the old radio above the stove. Its dial, with the names of far cities printed in faded gold, looked like a map of memories. He saw himself as a boy in Saint-Fiacre, hearing a voice from somewhere else and believing it spoke only to him. He felt, briefly and without indulgence, the tenderness one feels for machines that have been asked to do more than they were promised. Outside, the street had loosened its shoulders. A knife grinder's bell tinkled, the same tired note as the cafe's door, but carried forward by a man who believed in utility. Maigret turned toward the river, thinking of the typed sentence, of Verdon's empty chair facing a mirror, of the reporter pacing by a phone that breathed like a patient. The city showed him its ordinary face, which is always the face it puts on after a crime, as if modesty could erase memory. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors smelled of rain and wool again. A clerk intercepted him at the stairs with a hand that tried not to tremble. "For you, Monsieur le Commissaire," he said, extending an envelope with no address, no stamp, no handwriting, only a blank like a door. Inside, a typing like the one from the café, the weak R, the possessive E. Another voice tonight, a woman, Rue des Ursulines, midnight. If you listen, you will hear her ask to be forgiven by the wrong man. Maigret read the line aloud to the empty air of his office, the words falling on the floorboards like coins that had decided not to roll. He looked at the map, at the thread he had drawn from Rue de Charonne toward the freight yards, at the new dot that now asked to be connected. The city's nervous system lit up in his mind, junction by junction, as if a physician were touching a probe along a spine. He folded the note, put it in his pocket beside the cafe's sentence, and went to the window. The river kept its counsel. Lamps woke early along the quay, halos smudged by the damp. Somewhere a child laughed in a stairwell and was shushed. Somewhere a radio turned low, reconsidered its allegiance between music and snow. Midnight was not far. The air in the room felt as if it had been asked to hold its breath. He reached for his hat with the slow certainty of a man who had stopped believing in coincidences long before he stopped believing in weather. In the corridor he spoke without raising his voice, and the building began to move. Janvier with his collar turned up, Lucas with the file he had not been asked for, a driver who had learned to idle like a cat. As he stepped into the night, he felt the city lean toward him, listening. By the time Maigret reached Rue des Ursulines, the city had folded itself into that narrow hour between wakefulness and dream. Rain had come and gone, leaving behind a sheen on the stones that turned lamplight into trembling puddles of gold. The air smelled of rusted gutters and cheap perfume, the residue of human intentions rinsed by weather. He walked without haste, the brim of his hat dripping, the collar of his coat turned up to catch the damp. Each sound, footsteps, shutters, a cough from some unseen window, seemed part of a sentence the city was trying to finish, but could not quite remember. The street itself was quiet, a narrow rib between taller buildings that leaned forward as if conspiring. A single lamp at the corner threw enough light to make the darkness deliberate. There was the faint pulse of a wireless set behind one of the shutters, its low hum like the breath of a sleeping animal. Somewhere deeper in the block, a woman laughed once, abruptly, as if startled by her own amusement, and then the silence closed over it. Lucas was waiting by the mouth of the alley, cigarette cupped against the rain. "No sign of a woman," he said. "No sign of anything." Maigret nodded, though his eyes were elsewhere. "You hear it?" he asked. Lucas frowned, listening. Through the drizzle came a thin thread of static, not from the sky, not from the houses exactly, but from the space between them. It was faint but insistent, like the murmur of a crowd one floor below. "There," Maigret said softly. "Do you hear the rhythm? Almost like breathing." They followed it, step by step, the sound guiding them past shuttered bakeries and locked doors until it led them to a basement window where a sliver of light leaked through the cracks in the boards. Maigret crouched, the rain soaking the knees of his trousers, and peered inside. What he saw was less a room than an arrangement of shadows around a single lamp. Wires hung from the ceiling like vines. In the center, a table with a radio set, stripped of its casing, valves glowing like the eyes of insects. And beside it, motionless, a woman sat with her back to the wall, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had been waiting to be found. He pushed open the door without knocking. The hinges complained softly, and the smell of ozone and cold tea filled the stairwell. The woman looked up. Her face was pale, ordinary, but her eyes were those of someone who had already travelled too far inward to be startled by intrusion. She was neither young nor old. Her dress was simple, the kind one wears when one has stopped caring who might be watching. "You're late," she said, her voice almost conversational. "He said you would come sooner." "Who?" Maigret asked. "The man on the radio." She smiled faintly, as if humoring him. "He speaks to me every night now. Sometimes he tells me things that haven't happened yet. Sometimes he tells me to listen for you." Maigret took off his hat, shaking rain from the brim. "You've heard his voice?" "Of course. Haven't you?" He said nothing. The radio between them whispered its static like a nervous witness. On the table lay an envelope, the same kind he had received, unmarked, colourless, folded with care. He picked it up and turned it over. The flap was sealed with nothing more than moisture. Inside was a single sheet, typed on the same defective machine, the same weak R, the same jealous E. "You are looking for me in the wrong places. I am closer than your reflection." He placed the letter beside the lamp. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It came under my door at dusk," she said. I didn't read it until after the voice stopped. It seemed impolite to read before listening. "Do you know who wrote it?" She shook her head, a movement so slight it might have been the flicker of the lamp. "No one writes letters anymore, only ghosts do. They arrive without return addresses because they've forgotten where they began." He studied her face, the slight quiver of her mouth, the dryness of her hands. There was no sign of fear, only the kind of weariness that follows too much listening. "What does he tell you?" he asked. "That everything is a rehearsal," she said. "That the city is a stage and we are its static. He says one day he'll stop speaking and I'll miss him. That's the test, he says, to see who notices the silence first." Maigret moved closer to the radio. The set hummed faintly, but offered no station, no voice. He reached to turn the dial. She caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she said sharply. "You'll wake him." "Who?" "The one who listens back." The words were absurd, but they carried a conviction that made them plausible. Maigret pulled gently free and turned the dial anyway. For a moment the hiss deepened, became a tremor of low sound, then broke apart into fragments, a man's voice, distant but distinct, speaking not words but syllables arranged like a melody. Then it stopped. Only the rain remained. He looked at her again. She had closed her eyes, lips moving soundlessly. "He's gone now," she whispered. "You frightened him." "You can tell me his name?" "He has many. Sometimes he calls himself Verdun. Sometimes he says he's no one at all." He waited, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. "You knew the woman by the river?" The eyelids trembled. "She listened too closely. He doesn't like that." "And you?" Maigret said. "I don't listen," she said, opening her eyes. "I translate." He almost smiled. "For whom?" "For him, for you, for whoever is left when it's finished." Lucas shifted at the door, impatient, uncomfortable, in the presence of madness that wore such a reasonable face. Maigret straightened. "We'll need to take you with us, madame. You'll be safer at the Quai des Orfèvres." She looked at him with pity. "There's no safety there." He said so. Nevertheless, he gestured to Lucas, who stepped forward. But before he could touch her, she reached out and switched off the lamp. The room folded into darkness, and for a heartbeat, Maigret could hear nothing but the pulse of the rain outside and the faint whisper of the radio as it died. When the light returned, Lucas's torch cutting a white wound through the dark, the chair was empty. The window above the table stood open, rain blowing in. The fire escape rattled with retreating footsteps that could have been human or merely wind. They searched the alley, the adjoining courtyards, the rooftops. Nothing. It was as though the woman had evaporated into the weather, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and the echo of her words. Back in the room, the envelope still lay on the table, its paper curling slightly in the damp. Beneath it, the faintest impression of typing remained pressed into the wood, like a signature signed too often. Maigret traced the grooves with a fingertip. The letters formed a single word. Echo. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the nightmen looked up when he entered, then quickly looked down again. The building had taken on the hush of a church after Vespers. He went to his office, hung his coat to drip, and laid the new letter beside the others. 3 now, each identical, each delivered by invisible hands. Together they looked like a correspondence between the living and the dead. He poured himself a measure of the rough brandy he kept for nights like this, and drank it without ceremony. The burn steadied him. The pipe remained cold in his pocket. Some silences preferred not to be disturbed. He took out the ash-stained scrap from Verdun's room, the typed frequencies, and compared them to the lines in the letters. There was no overlap. Yet when he held them side by side, the spacing matched. If one read them together, alternating letters, they formed something like a pattern. A code, perhaps, but not one made for numbers. It was musical, repetitive, almost, he smiled bitterly, like breathing. The telephone rang once. He hesitated, staring at it. The ring came again, softer this time, as if embarrassed to insist. He lifted the receiver, static. Then under it, a woman's voice, barely a whisper. "He forgives you." He didn't answer. He only listened. The voice continued, fading in and out with the rhythm of rain against the window. "He says you'll find him when you stop looking for men and start listening to the air." Then silence. He replaced the receiver slowly, aware that his hand was trembling. The city outside was still awake, though pretending otherwise. He looked toward the river, unseen, but felt winding through Paris like a sentence without punctuation. Somewhere, he thought, a transmitter was humming again. Somewhere a man, or something that had learned to imitate one, was preparing the next broadcast. He turned off the office light, letting the glow from the street lamps pool across the floorboards. For a long time he stood there, the letters spread before him like footprints that refused to lead anywhere, and the hum of the building in his ears sounded unmistakably like breathing. By the hour when bakers begin to doubt their ovens and the last drunks attempt sincerity, the city's nerves reveal themselves. Wires that in daylight seem part of the furniture show their tautness against the sky. Poles align like tired soldiers. Insulators glimmer with a faint, cold polish. Maigret stood at the edge of the freight yards beyond the boulevards, where Paris thins into allotments, sheds, and promises that never grew into houses. The abandoned telegraph substation crouched in a wedge of dark brick, blackened by weather, its windows blind with dust. A fence of buckled iron guarded nothing with the obstinacy of the forgotten. The river's breath reached even here, metallic and damp, the scent of rails and wet rope settling under his coat. Lucas and Janvier waited with two municipal technicians who had the pallor of men raised among batteries. One of them, a narrow fellow with a velvet case of instruments, set his box upon the broken sill and unlatched it with the reverence of a musician. The other smoked carefully, cupping the ember as if even his ash must be measured. The rain had withdrawn to a sulk, leaving a humidity that collected under hat brims and between collar and skin. "They keep power to the block intermittently," the narrow fellow said, as if speaking to the building rather than to Maigret. "Enough to keep vandals entertained and rats ambitious. If someone wished to feed a small transmitter without drawing notice, he could drink from the residue." Maigret nodded, his eyes travelling along the drooping lines that fed into the substation like veins to an amputated limb. "And if someone wished to make the city believe it speaks to itself?" The man with the cigarette gave a small, unfunny smile. "Then he would come here for the acoustics." They pried the door and went inside. The smell of old hot metal, of dust that has learned to cling, rose at once. A bird, some brave or foolish creature, beat once against the rafters and settled. The technician's lamp opened a corridor through darkness, revealing a floor where oil had once pooled and dried into continent shapes, a bench with tools furred by rust, coils stacked like the vertebrae of an extinct animal. Maigret touched a length of copper, and his finger came away gleaming as if he had been reading an old coin. They found the main room beyond a partition, a square space with a high ceiling, and a grid of old insulators like a chandelier built by accountants. The air was not still. It carried a suggestion of sound too low to be heard, a pressure at the temples, the way one knows a storm before the clouds remember their work. Against the far wall, someone had cleared a table. On it lay the tidy geometry of a portable set, its casing off, its valves bright as garnets. A ground wire ran from the table to a copper pipe, and from there along the wall to a junction where the city's indifference became a kind of permission. Maigret did not speak. He had the feeling he had entered a room where a patient sleeps at last, and the nurse forbids conversation. Janvier moved in a slow circle, as if trying not to wake the boards. Lucas stood in the doorway, outwardly at ease, inwardly counting exits and foolish hopes. "Don't touch the tuning," the narrow technician whispered, already touching it with the tenderness of a thief. "If the gentleman prefers to address an audience of 3, we may persuade him to prefer 4. The lamp found an envelope propped against the base of the set, unadorned, inevitable. Maigret lifted it with the modesty due to a letter that had expected him. Inside a single sheet. Tonight, a counterpoint. The city can hold 2 voices if it holds its breath. He placed the page beside the other letters in his mind, felt its weight beside the word that had signed itself into wood. Echo. The technician fitted his headphone loop and drew a breath that struck Maigret as prayer masquerading as expertise. "He's near," the man murmured. "Not in kilometers, in intention." "What does that mean?" Lucas asked, more gently than his words. "That he could be in the next room or the next arrondissement," the man said. "He's playing with reflection. He sets his wave so it meets itself coming back." The comedy of it would have appealed to Maigret on another night, a city arguing with its mirror until both believed the other to be first. He leaned his palms upon the table, close enough to feel the faint warmth of the valves. The set gave him nothing but a sense, a rumour of breath. He looked at the wall where the torn wallpaper revealed an older paper beneath, flowers the colour of memory. The first voice entered without ceremony, neither greeting nor threat. Bonsoir. It arrived not in the ears exactly, but on the skin. The headphone man flinched. The one with the cigarette held his smoke uninhaled. The sound used the room the way a careful guest uses a corridor, stepping where the floor protests least. "Monsieur le commissaire," the voice went on, patient, almost tender, "you understand now that a city can speak across itself. It needs only a conductor, not a conductor's baton." The technician's hand trembled upon the dial. "He's circling," he whispered. "He's letting the walls play." "Where are you?" Maigret asked quietly, as if he were in a ward at night. "I'd like to meet your face." "A face is an address," the voice said. "You prefer envelopes with stamps." "I prefer letters with urgency." Janvier's gaze moved briefly to the doorway, as if a face might oblige by arriving. Nothing. The second voice came then, as the letter had promised, entering with the humility of someone who has not practiced speaking aloud. "Please." It paused, gathered itself. "Please forgive me." A woman. Not the woman by the river. This one carried a tremor that suggested not fear, but a habit of apology. "I didn't know he meant to." Static gnawed the line, then released it. "You see," the first voice said, unspooled silk on iron, "a city can hold two confessions at once, and the sum is not truth, but harmony." "Who is she?" Maigret asked. "Who are you for her, if not the man by the water?" "I am the man by the air," the voice said. "And she is the space that allows a sound to become itself." The woman tried again, braver now, like someone climbing a staircase in the dark. "Inspector, monsieur, listen to me. He told me to write the letters. He said it would keep you near the right streets. He said—" The first voice overlapped her, soft but inexorable. "Don't ruin the ending." The technicians were frantic with patience, fingers minute upon the coils. The one with the cigarette finally remembered to inhale and choked on the result, eyes watering in dignified silence. Janvier's jaw had set, the muscle reminding him of old nights outside worse doors. "Why do you speak?" Maigret asked, ignoring the shape of the trap, as one ignores an ache that will only tighten if named. A killer hides, a coward runs, a liar writes letters. You do all three, and yet you keep a schedule. What is it you want to hear? There was a pause. Maigret could hear the freight yard beyond the walls, the small clanks of metal without intention. "A certain sentence," the man said finally. "The one a policeman saves for himself. The sentence that admits he has believed, for 1 minute, in something unprovable." And what is unprovable tonight? That a voice without a face can be guilty of anything the law recognizes. The woman broke in quickly, almost tripping over her own breath. "He thinks if he tells you before he does it, it becomes your memory instead of his." "What is it?" Janvier demanded, though he knew she could not hear him except as a shape in air. "He wants an audience," she whispered. "He wants you to be the echo." "He promised me nothing would be real. unless you heard it first." A warmth crept along Maigret's spine that had nothing to do with the room. He looked at the envelope again, at the dainty assurance of the line, counterpoint. "Where are you?" he repeated, softer than before, as if asking a child under a bed to name the game. The woman answered, fast, before the man could erase her. "Near Gare du Nord. A room above a cobbler's. He keeps the set under the bed when he sleeps. He doesn't sleep." "Please." Static ate her, or fear did. The man's voice returned, as if from down a hall. "She is mistaken out of kindness. Kindness mislocates everything." Lucas, already moving, looked to Maigret for the nod he needed more than permission. Maigret gave it with a fractional tilt, and Lucas slipped out, taking the technician with the cigarette and a speed that had been earned through years when seconds meant hands instead of wires. Janvier stayed, planted as surely as the table, eyes on the dials as if they might bloom. "You used Verdun," Maigret said, "as a name, as a room. Did you also use a woman like a frequency?" "We use each other," the voice said mildly. "You use the weight of your pipe, the pace of your steps to persuade the world to answer the way you need it to. I use the air. We are cousins." The comparison did not offend Maigret. It reached him. He let it sit with him like a guest whose coat he knows he will never ask to leave. "And the woman by the river?" She believed the set could hear her back. A note of amusement, then of regret so convincing it might have been real. She stepped into the wrong silence. The lamp in the technician's hand sputtered as if someone had breathed upon it. The voice softened further, uncoiling. "Listen." They did. The room gave them nothing at first, and then a sound that might have been the far-off report of a door closing, the thinnest echo of tin, the kind of sound the memory produces when it has run out of facts and begun to invent. The woman's whisper returned, so small it could have been an error. "Forgive me." A whisper never knows to whom it speaks. "Forgiveness is a transaction," Maigret said to the air, to the room, to the past. "It requires two parties in daylight." "And daylight requires faith," the man answered, with what might have been admiration. "You remain a romantic, Inspector. That's why I chose you." The lamp began to dim. Not the lamp, Maigret realized, but his own resolve, being asked to illuminate too much at once. The technician adjusted, murmuring to the set like a nurse to a stubborn pulse. The woman said a name then, not Verdun. A name that struck no bell in the room and yet left a vibration that made the dust on the insulators shift. Maigret filed it where he files those things that will matter when they can do the most harm. The line thinned, the man's voice receded until it was only the idea of a voice. "Good night, Monsieur le Commissaire. If there is a face, you will recognize it by its politeness." The last thing was not sound, but the sensation of being looked at through a wall. Then the room returned to its refusal. They waited, as men do when a theatre's curtain falls and no applause has been rehearsed. The technician took off his headset with the gravity of a surgeon, and for a moment everyone listened to the absence. It had texture now, it had claims. "Gare du Nord," Janvier said quietly. "We'll net the street," Maigret answered, though nets are ridiculous metaphors in cities. He glanced at the envelope again, at the promise of counterpoint, and thought of Madame Delaunay's old radio, with its cracked grill, of the reporter's ink-stained fingers, of the woman in the basement whose apology seemed rehearsed. He felt the case shift, not like a door, but like a floor that realizes it must hold more weight. They stepped out into the yard. The sky over the tracks had taken on the bruised translucence that comes before morning, admits defeat. Lamps along the siding burned with the resignation of men on night shifts. Somewhere far off, a whistle complained, Somewhere closer, a cat chose its loyalties. Maigret lit his pipe and let it go out again. The smoke rose in a thread, then surrendered to air that had already chosen its own story. A boy with a bicycle watched them from behind a pile of timber, the way boys watch policemen, with a hunger for rules and an appetite for exceptions. "What is this place?" he asked, not really asking. "A room where the city used to speak," Maigret said. "Does it still?" "Only when spoken to." The boy nodded as if that were a kind of hope. He pedalled off, tires whispering on the damp gravel. On the road back toward the centre, they passed a church whose stone kept its own weather. Janvier drove with the gentleness of men who have learned not to wake the next catastrophe. At a crossing, a tram clattered through, its windows full of faces nursing their own early sorrows. Maigret looked at them and thought of the sentence the man had demanded, the unprovable one. He did not have it. He had instead a handful of voices and an understanding that some crimes are committed not to end a life, but to colonize a city's bloodstream. By the time the quay came into view, the river had found its grey again. In the office, the letters waited on the desk like patient guests. He placed the newest beside them, a quartet now, and stood with his hands on the back of his chair, not sitting, not moving, as if stillness might invite the air to confess. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, the city drew a breath. The morning after, the voices felt unreal, like something borrowed from another man's dream. Paris was already loud with its usual quarrels, the clatter of carts, the gossip of drains, the dignified rage of pigeons on cornices, and yet beneath it, Maigret sensed another hum, a pulse too steady to belong to ordinary life. It followed him through the streets, a vibration more than a sound, as if every wire above the boulevards carried the ghost of the conversation from the substation. He stopped once at a tobacconist's window, staring at the reflection of his own face behind rows of cheap pipes and postcards. For a moment he thought he saw another man staring back. Same coat, same hat, but the mouth was smiling. He turned away quickly. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting with a thin file and the tired brightness of a man who had been awake long enough to start trusting his ideas. "We found the room near Gare du Nord," he said. "Third floor. Above the cobblers, as the woman said. A set under the bed, and something else." He placed on the desk a microphone, heavy, black, with a small plaque at the base engraved with the initials V. D. Maigret looked at it as one looks at a relic, half curiosity, half distrust. "Verdun," he said, "or whoever chose to be him." Lucas nodded. But the wiring was strange. The set was designed to transmit and receive simultaneously, as if he wanted to talk to himself and be answered. The idea pleased Maigret in a grim way. He touched the microphone's metal body. It was cool, almost damp, like a hand that had just let go of something it shouldn't have held. "Did you find him?" "No. The neighbours said he left 2 nights ago, paid his rent a month in advance, polite as a priest. One of them remembered seeing him carry a suitcase shaped like a coffin for a cat. Light, too light. Anyone follow him? We tried. He vanished into the morning crowds. But there was one more thing." Lucas opened the file, revealing a photograph, the woman from Rue des Ursulines, the one who'd spoken of the voice and disappeared into the rain. She was seen with him 3 days ago at the post office on Boulevard de Magenta. They mailed a parcel together. Maigret leaned closer. "What sort of parcel?" "No one knows. The clerk remembered because the woman paid with coins and her hand was shaking, addressed to a journalist at La Dépêche de Paris." The reporter again. The city had its own cruel symmetry. "Call him," Maigret said. An hour later, the man arrived, pale and half-shaved, the smell of ink and anxiety clinging to him. He sat down without invitation. "I received your parcel," he said, "this morning. No return address." He placed it on the desk, a small wooden box, varnished, sealed with wax. Maigret nodded for Lucas to open it. Inside lay a spool of wire, a compact reel of magnetic tape, labelled in neat handwriting, "The Confession of a Voice." The reporter crossed himself unconsciously, as though words alone could be cursed. "I didn't listen," he said. "I wanted you to." Maigret motioned to Janvier, who fetched a recorder from the archive room. The machine whirred to life with the patience of old machinery. Lucas threaded the tape. Static filled the office, soft but alive. Then a voice, low, calm, courteous, the kind one might trust to sell you a lie. "This is for the man who listens. You think you are hunting a murderer. You are hunting an echo. I have never killed anyone. I have only said what others were about to do." The tone was deliberate, almost amused. "The woman by the river, she was already dead before I spoke of her. The journalist, he was already frightened before I called him. And you, Maigret, you were already listening before I began." Maigret did not move. The voice continued, "You think the law protects silence. It doesn't. It only punishes those who cannot control their voices. I learned to control mine. I learned that if you speak a crime before it happens, it belongs to the one who hears it." Lucas reached for the stop button, but Maigret lifted a hand. "Let it play." "You wonder why I choose you," the voice said. "Because you are the only one in this city who still believes in truth that cannot be written down. We are the same, you and I. You listen to men until they reveal what they fear most. I listen until they repeat it." A pause, then the faint shuffle of papers, the creak of a chair. "I did not kill the woman. I only gave her permission to die. She wanted her story told. I told it. That makes me guilty of art, not murder." The tape clicked softly. Maigret leaned forward. "There's more," he said. The reel turned again, slower now. A woman's voice entered, the same trembling softness as before. "He told me to speak. He said if I read his words into the radio, he would stop. He promised he would stop." The man's voice, "Don't apologize. The air forgives everything." Then the unmistakable sound of struggle, a chair knocked over, a gasp, silence. Lucas stopped the machine. The tape spooled loosely, the end flapping like a tongue. No one spoke. The reporter looked as though he might be sick. Maigret tapped ash into the tray that hadn't moved in hours. "He records everything," he said, "even the moment he disappears." Janvier broke the silence. "If he isn't killing them, then who is?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, looking down at the slow, grey procession of cars along the quay. "He kills them by lending them his voice," he said finally. "By making them believe someone else has already decided their fate?" The reporter rubbed his hands together. "You think he's still in Paris?" "No," Maigret said. "Paris is in him." The afternoon waned toward dusk. They sent the reporter home with a warning not to speak to the press. The building settled into its nightly creaks and whispers. Maigret remained in his office, the microphone on the desk beside the letters, the tape reel rewound but still warm. He stared at it as if it might choose to speak again. Outside, the rain returned, steady and narrow. Somewhere a tram bell rang. He heard the faint echo through the wires that lined the building, the resonance of a city breathing through copper. For the first time he wondered whether the man's voice had ever existed apart from these circuits, whether perhaps it was nothing more than the city's own guilt finding a tongue. He turned the microphone toward himself, fingers resting on the switch. For a moment he imagined speaking, saying the words the other voice had longed for. "I believe you." Instead, he said nothing. The silence thickened. Somewhere down the hall, a radio crackled to life, then died again. He stood, the chair scraping faintly against the floorboards. "Lucas," he said into the corridor, "have the technicians trace every private line connected to the substation and find out where this model microphone was sold." When he was alone again, he allowed himself one more look at the city outside, the lamps reflecting on Whetstone, the smoke from barges curling like question marks above the Seine. He could almost hear the hum again, the endless dialogue of signals passing unseen from one rooftop to another. The phone on his desk rang once. He answered it automatically. Static. Then a man's breath, slow, steady, impossibly close. "Bonsoir, Maigret," said the voice. "I wanted you to know the next voice you hear will not be mine." The line clicked dead. He stood there, receiver still in his hand, staring into the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere beyond the reach of law or reason, another broadcast was already beginning. Toward evening, the city learned a new sound, something like rain that refused the sky. Telephones rang and did not ring, radios breathed and then held their breath. In the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres, conversations frayed at the edges, not because men lacked words, but because they distrusted what words might turn into once loosed. Maigret moved through that hush with a coat freshly wet from the short walk along the quay, pipe unlit, hat leaving darker ellipses on floorboards where drops fell. Behind his door, the microphone waited, the black cylinder, with its engraved letters VD, patient, as a relic. The tape sat beside it, rewound, a coil of captured air. Lucas came in without knocking, which meant he had learned something that did not want to be asked permission to exist. "The microphone was sold at a shop in Rue des Petits Champs," he said. "Receipt signed by Verdon, weeks ago. But the clerk remembers the woman more than the man." "The woman?" Maigret said, and heard how the single word gathered everyone they had met who could be that woman. The listener at the café with the swallow brooch, the pale figure in the basement on Rue des Ursulines, the unseen voice threading apologies through static. "She did the talking," Lucas said. He nodded. She asked about simultaneous transmit and receive. The clerk thought she had the mind for it. He used the phrase bon élève and then corrected himself. "No, not a student, the sort of person who teaches herself, so she can stop listening to others." Janvier appeared in the doorway, as if pulled there by the sentence. "And the journalist?" he asked. "Our friend at La Dépêche." "He went home," Lucas said. "Or somewhere that resembled home enough to fool his conscience. He's frightened in a way that will make him brave about the wrong thing." Maigret put the pipe down and reached for the letters, fanning them as one does a cheap hand of cards one plays because the night is long. The defective R, the jealous E, counterpoint, echo. The insistence that the air, not the apparatus, held the guilt. He thought of the woman's line, "I don't listen, I translate," and felt again the little draft that passes across a room just before a door chooses to open. The telephone rang once, then twice, then held, like a singer afraid of her first note. He lifted the receiver, static. Then a woman's voice, immediate, unadorned, so close it altered the air in the room. "Monsieur Maigret," she said without tremor. "No titles. I need you awake, not polite. He thinks he is the story. He's only the chorus." "Where are you?" he asked, and heard in his own question how men ask for addresses when what they want are faces. "Near the river," she said. "Always near the river. But listen, because the geography will not save you. He's about to call the newspapers. He will say there will be a confession at 8. He will promise a name, He will promise mine. And will it be yours? Maigret said. It will be whoever believes it first, she answered. He collects belief like stamps. The line clicked softly, not a goodbye, more the sound of a thought changing rooms. The desk clock said 7:45. Maigret felt the building tilt toward the hour the way a mariner feels a current he had not accounted for. In the corridor, men began to move with the economy of those who have long practice at pretending they are not hurrying. The evening edition boys on the boulevard shouted headlines that had not yet been typeset. Paris lifted its chin to listen. At 8, precisely, the city sprouted mouths. Sets clicked on, boxes hummed. Even those who had sworn off news for the sake of their digestion found their fingers turning the dial. In cafes, women set down their forks. In attic rooms, men stood beside beds as if the floor could better conduct a voice into their bones. Maigret remained in his chair and did not turn the microphone toward himself. Instead, he watched the dark glass of the window, where his face refused to remain only his. The first voice came as promised, calm, courteous, with that insinuating civility that made men forgive and distrust in the same breath. Good evening, Paris. No name offered. Names were for the arrested. You have been patient. You deserve your confession. The woman by the river met her death in company. She met it because she loved a sound more than a face. He paused, letting the sentence settle upon the city like coal dust upon a sill. You want a culprit? He went on. You want a hand you can take and place upon a table? Very well. She wore a swallow at her throat because she hoped to be carried away by her listening. The person who killed her, static raked the words. Then the unmistakable blade of another voice cut across his. Stop using her! The woman's tone was not pleading this time, but exact. You didn't kill her, but you taught her how to leave. You told her that if a voice said the ending first, the world would be obliged to perform it. You are not a murderer. You are a rehearsal that refuses to end. Paris leaned forward. The city is shameless. When it hears someone speak against a man who sounds like authority. The man's reply came silkier, but the silk snagged. Madame. No, she said, not Madame. I will not be Madame by a voice. If you want a title, call me what you made of me, your second voice. The sound swelled. It was not volume, it was attention, the collective weight of thousands leaning toward the same gap between stations. In the newsroom of La Dépêche, men froze with their hands on levers. At Madame Delaunay's café, conversation, that trained animal, sat. In a fourth-floor room above Rue de Charonne, a young widow turned down the gas because quiet burns brighter in the dark. The man found his syllables. You invited yourself, my dear. You wanted to matter. Everyone wants to matter, she said, and beneath the sentence lay the timbre of tears that had already dried. You taught me that the shortest path to mattering is to be repeated. So repeat me now. You promised you would stop when I read your words into the set. You promised you would let me return to a life where voices stay in people's heads. But you found you preferred the air. If the city had been a room, it would have felt just then the chill that comes when the stove gives its last good heat. Maigret stood, not because standing accomplished anything, but because some truths require a change in spine. He gestured to Lucas, who was already at the door, with the technicians on a string, and to Janvier, whose hand found the map without looking. The woman continued, and now the air learned she did not tremble when she argued. He did not kill the woman by the river. She killed herself with help. His voice pushed her there, and a man with a face helped her down the steps. You want the face, Inspector? You will find it in the places where apologies are taught. cheap rooms, presses that speak all night, cafes where radios hang like saints above the stove. He borrows hands the way he borrows names. He borrowed mine. And now, Maigret said softly into nothing, because she could not hear him unless she wished to. Now I return what I borrowed, she said. I will speak my own sentence. I am not your culprit. I am your witness. The man laughed then, a small sound, the kind a gentleman produces when a waiter spills a drop of wine, and the evening must be rescued. You mistake the stage for the script. Without me, there is no play. There will be silence, she said, and they will hear it. The line splintered, not into noise, but into the pure shape of a broadcast, failing, a flutter that belonged to physics and consequence. Then, another sound beneath the failure, something like a door but not a door, the clatter of wood against tile, a chair leg perhaps, the scrape of a shoe, and behind it the human intake of breath when a decision is made too quickly for it to be wise. "Track it," Maigret said, and the technicians did what technicians do when asked to be magicians. Dials moved, pencils described little hurricanes on paper. One shook his head with the helpless fury of a man obliged to report that the sea refuses to provide an address. "Near the islands," he said at last, not meaning islands, but those damp wedges of stone along the Seine where men go to become either brave or cowards. The echo rides the water. They went out into a Paris that had begun to rain. The droplets were fine and deliberate, the kind that mark the face like an argument you lose and learn from. Cars were already turning, pulled by the same human tide that moves even the stubborn in the direction of spectacle. Janvier drove with his jaw set. Lucas spoke as little as the wipers. The river met them with its clean, indifferent smell. Lamps buckled their halos in the wet. On Ile Saint-Louis, a small knot of people faced a square of light from a cellar window. Not a crowd, Paris has rules about how quickly a crowd may confess itself, but enough to change the temperature of the street. A woman in a shawl held the elbow of a man who had decided to drink at home and had lost. A boy stood near the curb with his cap wrong. He was trying to fix it without choosing a hand. Somewhere, a set muttered to itself like an old aunt waiting to be asked. They found the door by the sound of it being asked, to refuse and failing. The room beyond was low, unreasonable with damp. In the corner, a table with a set, its back off, on the floor spools of wire that had unrolled themselves in panic. Against the wall, a chair overturned at precisely the angle a man who believes in order would hate. And there, in front of the microphone, the woman who called herself second voice, not the cafe listener with the swallow, not the basement ghost, not a stranger exactly either, but a face that the city had been making for weeks out of rumour, hair pinned without vanity, hands that knew valves, eyes that had learned how not to ask to be believed. She did not flinch at the arrival of policemen any more than she had flinched at the arrival of words. The set still hummed under her fingers, a living animal she intended to soothe. "He's 2 streets away," she said to Maigret before he asked. "He walks with the careful gait of a man carrying a full glass. He won't run. He wants to be overtaken at the right sentence." "Which sentence?" Maigret asked. "The one you don't want to say," she replied, with a small, tired smile that made him think of Madame Delaunay's remark about churches with smaller choirs. "The one that makes you a participant." Her eyes slid to the window, as if listening to footsteps through weather. Somewhere a tram bell rang, a sound that makes promises to no one. The technicians crouched over the set with the greed of devotion. Janvier stood in the doorway, wondering which passer-by would fail to pass by. Lucas moved his weight from heel to toe, as if the floor might confess, if asked with kindness enough times. The woman put one hand upon the microphone and spoke, not into the room, but into the river. "No more," she said. "No, do you hear me? No more rehearsals. If you want to be caught, pick a face and wear it." The reply arrived not through the set, but through the window. A voice from the street, polite, close, that made the hair on Maigrate's forearms stir because proximity changes the shape of fear. "I am wearing one," the man said, and his footsteps halted as if to allow the sentence its frame. "It is the face that believed me first." Silence did what she had promised. It made everyone listen harder. Maigret moved past the woman, past the table, up the short steps into the wet. The street was not empty. Streets in Paris rarely are. But it had that arrangement of motion one recognizes without learning. Those who have a place to be continue at a pace that proves it. Those who do not, pause. At the corner, under a lamp that tired of its job an hour ago, a man stood with his hat brim pulled low and his hands unconspicuously visible. He could have been anyone, and therefore was the one they needed. "Verdun," Maigret said, not as identification, but as a tool. The head lifted, and a mouth smiled not because it wished to, but because smiling was part of the design. The eyes were unremarkable, which is how some eyes get everything they want. "You'll say I'm only a voice, and you can't arrest a voice," the man said pleasantly. "So I have obliged you with a body." "For whose benefit?" Maigret asked. "For yours," the man said, and the words carried no sarcasm, only a sincerity that repulsed. "You require a face to forgive or to blame, otherwise the city will never stop listening." Behind Maigret, the woman's silhouette appeared in the doorway, a darker shape against the damp light. She put a hand on the jamb the way a singer touches the curtain before stepping out to end a song. The man inclined his head, as if acknowledging his co-performer. "Two voices," he said. "A harmony undone. It takes both to close a story." "And which one belongs to the living?" Maigret said. The man laughed softly. "Does it matter? You listen to us the same." "It matters to the law," Maigret said. "Then you must choose," the man replied. "Choose whose words become the truth once they are written down." He took a step toward the lamp, the hat brim lifting, the mouth preparing another sentence, the eyes set to remain ordinary. The rain found the edge of his collar and ran in. Somewhere, farther off, a siren began to insist upon its own existence. The river breathed. Paris breathed with it. Maigret did not step forward, not yet. He felt in his pocket the coarse paper of the letters, their typed arrogance, the way they had arranged a city around a frequency. He felt the room behind him, the woman at the threshold, the set that hummed, because no one had yet told it otherwise. He understood that to close this, he would have to decide which voice would be allowed to fall silent first. He lifted his hand, not to draw his revolver. There are nights when metal only makes matters noisier, but to indicate something simpler, older. "Enough," he said, to the man, to the woman, to the air. And the street, which had been braced for spectacle, learned the weight of that single word. The man's smile altered by a millimeter, which is how some smiles end. The woman let out a breath she had been saving for months. The river kept moving, which is what rivers do when stories decide to stop traveling. In the space that followed, decisions would have to be made in daylight. The Seine looked like melted pewter, dull and restless, sliding under its bridges with the sullen persistence of a habit. Morning gathered itself along the embankment, coal smoke, chill air, and the slow scuff of boots. Inside the Quai des Orfèvres, the day had already been awake for hours. Typewriters murmured behind closed doors. Telephones rang and were immediately regretted. Maigret sat at his desk, hat on the corner, pipe unlit, and a single envelope resting before him like an unasked question. Verdun had a face now, a body that the city could point to and say, "There he is." He was sitting 2 floors below, in a cell whose light worked only when it felt generous. Lucas had watched him all night. The man had eaten nothing, slept briefly, and spoken to no one. He had only requested, with the politeness that never seemed to leave him, that his radio be returned. When refused, he had smiled and said, "Then please see that it doesn't learn bad habits while I'm gone." Maigret's fingers toyed with the matchbox on the desk. The envelope contained a typed page, found in the woman's room after she had been taken to the hospital. The same typewriter, the same frail rhythm of letters. Forgive him. He only wanted to hear what silence sounds like once you give it a name. He read it again, then looked up as Lucas entered, rain still clinging to his shoulders. "He asked for you," Lucas said. "No lawyer, no complaint. He said he would only speak once, and only to you." Maigret nodded. "Is she alive?" "Barely. The doctors say she'll keep breathing if someone reminds her to." He stood, took his coat from the chair, and made his way downstairs. The corridor to the cells smelled of disinfectant and patience. A guard unlocked the door, then withdrew as if the air inside required solitude. Verdun sat on the cot, hands folded, coat still immaculate. His hat rested beside him, the brim wet from rain that had not touched anyone else. "I wondered," Verdun said, "how long you would keep me waiting. You've made me a famous man, you know. They'll print the word phantom before my name, and everyone will imagine the rest." Maigret pulled the single chair toward the table and sat. "Names aren't facts," he said. "They're only ways for people to recognize their own fear." Verdun smiled slightly. "And which fear have I recognized?" "That someone might listen. To you," Maigret said, "and find nothing underneath." The man's eyes brightened, almost with amusement. "Then let's make sure you find something. You've collected the letters, I assume. The tapes, the voices, the ghost of a woman who wanted to matter." "She's not dead," Maigret said. Verdun looked mildly disappointed. "That complicates things. I had planned my ending rather carefully. The woman by the river, the reporter, the cafes. You were everywhere and nowhere. Why?" Verdun considered the question as though it had been phrased too simply. "Because people listen harder to the air than to each other. I wanted to see how much they would believe before I gave them proof. I never touched her. I only told her what the city already whispered. You told her how to die." Verdun tilted his head. "Did I? Or did she finally hear what she'd been rehearsing? You can't arrest an echo, commissaire." Maigret leaned forward. "No, but I can arrest the man who built the chamber for it." For the first time, the other man's calm thinned. "You think I built something?" he said softly. "No, I found it. Paris built it long before I arrived. The wires, the machines, the hunger. I merely tuned it." The silence that followed seemed to expand between them, filling the cell like smoke. Somewhere, a door closed too firmly. Maigret could hear the hum of the lights, faint, electrical, alive. "You enjoy being understood," he said finally. "Of course. Understanding is the only form of forgiveness that counts." Maigret stood. "You'll get neither." As he reached the door, Verdun spoke again, almost gently. "Then at least keep listening. You'll find me again, in every broadcast, every whisper that feels rehearsed. I've made myself portable." Maigret paused, then turned the key without answering. Outside, the corridor felt colder. Lucas was waiting, pipe unlit, mirroring his chief without meaning to. "He talk?" "He said enough," Maigret murmured. "Too much of it made sense." They walked back upstairs together. The office window showed the river, dull silver now, dragging debris toward the sea. Janvier stood beside the desk, holding the morning paper. The headline shouted in letters large enough to be seen from the bridge. The phantom voice captured. Maigret ends radio murders. The inspector took the paper, scanned it, and folded it carefully in half. End, he said quietly, is a generous word. That night the building emptied itself of footsteps. The clerks left, the lamps dimmed. Maigret stayed. He poured himself a small measure of brandy, sat, and waited for the silence to settle in its proper shape. Around midnight he opened the drawer and took out the microphone. It felt heavier than before, as if the air inside it had learned something about weight. He placed it on the desk, turned it toward himself, and struck a match. The flame flared, then steadied. He spoke, not loudly, but with the evenness of a man giving a statement to no one in particular. This is Jules Maigret. The case is closed. The city is sleeping again, but the wires are still humming and the water still carries what we say to it. If anyone listens later, remember, it was only a voice. He released the switch and the lamp flickered once in sympathy. Then there was nothing but the ordinary hum of the building and the faint whisper of the Seine moving past the walls. At dawn, the cleaning woman found him still seated, the microphone gone, the desk bare except for the folded newspaper and a single envelope addressed to no one. Inside it, a note in Maigret's own hand: silence is never empty. It only waits for the next voice. Outside, Paris woke. The barges moved. Somewhere, on a forgotten frequency, a faint crackle began again, a breath, a syllable, a promise. And the river, indifferent as ever, carried it onward into another day.